The café buzzed with the lively chatter of regulars and the comforting clatter of cups. It was a haven of warmth against the biting cold outside. But the hum of activity came to an abrupt pause as the door creaked open, and in stepped a frail old man. Henry's presence was anything but commanding. His back was stooped, his steps faltering. A coat, worn thin over years of wear, hung limply on his bony shoulders, and his shoes, with soles barely intact, squelched faintly as he moved across the tiled floor. He carried himself with quiet resolve, but his hollow cheeks and trembling hands betrayed a desperate need. As Henry shuffled toward the counter, the café seemed to shift. Eyes followed him, some curious, some amused, and others filled with judgment. Whispers rippled through the room like an unsettling breeze. "Did you see his shoes? How did he even afford to walk in here?" a woman murmured to her friend. "Probably looking for a handout," another man scoffed, adjusting his scarf as if to shield himself from Henry's proximity. Henry didn't meet their eyes. Instead, he focused on the counter, where Gloria, the café owner, stood like a statue of disapproval. Her apron was pristine, but her expression was anything but welcoming. Henry hesitated before placing a small handful of crumpled coins on the counter. "Excuse me," he said, his voice as thin as his frame. "May I have the cheapest sandwich you have?" Gloria didn't even glance at the coins. Instead, she raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. "The cheapest sandwich?" she repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "This isn't a charity, old man. If you can't pay like everyone else, you can't eat here." The café fell silent. The clinking of spoons against porcelain ceased. All eyes turned toward the counter. Henry stiffened, his frail body seemingly shrinking under the weight of the stairs. His stomach growled audibly, a betrayal of his quiet dignity. "Please," he murmured, gripping the edge of the counter. "Just something small. Can't you read the room?" Gloria interrupted, her voice sharp and loud enough to carry across the café. "This isn't the place for beggars." Laughter erupted from a corner table where a group of young professionals sat. One of them, a man in a tailored coat, leaned back with a smug grin. "Maybe he should try the soup kitchen down the street." "Oh, wait, there isn't one." Henry's face flushed, the shame too much to bear. He turned, ready to leave, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. His stomach churned, not from hunger, but from the bitter humiliation that clung to him like a second skin. Suddenly the sharp click of heels echoed through the room. A commanding presence disrupted the tension like a lightning bolt splitting the sky. Eleanor stepped forward, her tailored coat draped elegantly over her shoulders, her eyes blazing with determination. She was no stranger to the café, but today her aura was electric, demanding attention. "Excuse me," Eleanor's voice rang out, cutting through the whispers like a blade. "Is this how you treat your customers?" Gloria froze, momentarily caught off guard by the interruption. She recovered quickly, her posture stiffening. "Ma'am, this man," Eleanor interrupted, stepping closer to the counter, "walked in here with money, didn't he? Or have you suddenly changed your policy to no entry for the elderly?" The café buzzed with a new energy. Gloria faltered, her eyes darting to the customers who were now fully engrossed in the confrontation. "He doesn't belong here," Gloria said defensively, but her voice lacked the authority it carried moments ago. "He can't even afford." "I'll pay," Eleanor declared firmly, pulling out her wallet. Her voice was calm, but her tone left no room for argument. She turned to Henry, her expression softening. "Sir, order anything you'd like. Lunch is on me." The room seemed to collectively exhale, but the tension lingered. Henry hesitated, his lips trembling as he struggled to find words. "A sandwich," he whispered finally. "Just a sandwich, please." Eleanor smiled gently. "Make it 2 sandwiches and a coffee," she said, turning to Gloria. Her eyes narrowed, her voice dropping just enough to make Gloria lean in. "And while you're at it, add a side of respect. He's earned it." As Gloria moved begrudgingly to prepare the order, Eleanor glanced down at Henry's wrist. A glint of silver caught her eye. There on his thin wrist was an old watch. The engraving on the back was faint but unmistakable. Et, forever loved Clara. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. Her breath caught in her throat. Could it be? The watch, the initials, it was impossible, yet here it was, staring back at her, pulling her into a past she had long buried. What do you think about this story so far? If you're enjoying it, comment 2 below. If there's something you think could make it even better, comment 7. Your feedback means everything to us. And don't forget to subscribe to Elderly Wisdom for more heartfelt and unforgettable stories. Let's dive into the next chapter of this tale. Trust me, it only gets better from here. Eleanor sat across from Henry at a small table in the corner of the café. The bustling noise had returned, but it felt muted, as if the world had dimmed around them. Her gaze was fixed on the watch, her thoughts racing. She couldn't ignore the initials, forever loved Clara. It was too specific, too personal to be a coincidence. "Sir," she began, her voice steady but tinged with curiosity, "that watch you're wearing, where did you get it?" Henry hesitated, instinctively pulling his sleeve over the watch. His cloudy eyes met hers, searching for an answer to a question he wasn't sure he could trust. "It was my son's," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "Elliot gave it to me before he passed away." Eleanor's breath caught. Elliot. The name hit her like a wave, carrying with it memories she thought she had locked away forever. She remembered a young man with a dazzling smile and a quiet strength, a man who had been her entire world until he vanished from it without warning. "Your son," she said carefully, her words deliberate. "What happened to him?" Henry looked down at the table, his hands trembling as they clutched his cup of coffee. He was a good man. Strong, brave, but life wasn't kind to him. After his mother passed, he struggled to keep us afloat. He worked too hard, carried too much, and one day, he was gone. Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat. She reached out, her hand gently covering his. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the weight of his words pressing heavily on her chest. Henry looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You asked about the watch. It's all I have left of him. He said it was from someone special, someone who meant the world to him." Eleanor's heart stopped. She could barely whisper the question that lingered in her mind. Did he ever mention a name?" Henry nodded slowly, his gaze distant as if he were peering into the past. "He did. He spoke about her often. He called her his light in the dark. Her name was Eleanor." The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She leaned back in her chair, her hands trembling. It wasn't just a coincidence. This was Elliot's watch. The man she had loved, the man she had lost, was Henry's son. The café seemed to fade away, replaced by a rush of memories. She saw herself and Elliot walking hand in hand under the glow of streetlights. She heard his laughter, felt the warmth of his touch. And then she remembered the pain of his sudden disappearance, the unanswered questions, the sleepless nights spent wondering why he had left without a word. But now, sitting before her, was a piece of the puzzle she never thought she'd find. Henry wasn't just an elderly man in need of kindness. He was a direct connection to the love she had never forgotten. "Sir," she said, her voice trembling, I think we need to talk. Before we dive deeper, let me ask you this. Have you ever found a piece of your past in the most unexpected place? Share your story in the comments below. And stay tuned, because what Eleanor discovers next will change everything. The café seemed frozen in time as Eleanor and Henry sat together, their worlds now inexplicably intertwined. Eleanor's mind raced with questions, but she steadied herself. Henry, despite his frailty, deserved a delicate approach. "Mr. Henry," she began softly. "I knew your son. Elliot was. He was very special to me." Henry's expression shifted. His tired eyes widened, and for the first time, a flicker of hope broke through the weight of his. Sorrow. "You knew my boy?" he asked, his voice quivering. Eleanor nodded, struggling to keep her emotions in check. "He and we were in love, years ago. But then, one day he vanished. I didn't know why. I'd thought—" She paused, the memories clawing at her. "I thought he chose to leave me." Henry let out a long, shaky breath. His hands gripped the edge of the table as he seemed to wrestle with a truth he had long buried. "Elliot never wanted to leave you," he said finally, his voice low. "He spoke about you all the time, Eleanor. He wanted to build a life with you." "Then why?" Eleanor's voice cracked. "Why did he leave?" Henry's eyes grew distant, his gaze fixed on the cup of coffee growing cold before him. "It was his mother, my wife Margaret. She didn't approve of you. She wanted Elliot to marry someone she thought was suitable, someone from a wealthy family who could secure his future. Margaret. She always thought she knew best." Eleanor's heart sank. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed still stung. "So she forced him to leave?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry shook his head. "No, not exactly. Elliot was torn. He didn't want to disappoint her, but he couldn't bear to lose you either. He tried to stand his ground, but Margaret made life unbearable for him. She threatened to cut him off, to ruin him if he didn't follow her wishes." Henry's voice faltered and he looked away, shame flickering in his eyes. "And I didn't stop her. I should have. But I was weak, Eleanor. I let her push him to the brink." Eleanor's chest tightened. She could feel the weight of Elliot's struggles as if they were her own. "What happened to him, Henry?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why didn't he ever come back?" Henry's hands trembled as he clasped them together. "After you. After he left you, he spiraled. He couldn't forgive himself, and he couldn't forgive Margaret. He started working himself to death, taking on more than he could handle just to escape the pain. And then one night, his voice broke. There was an accident. He didn't make it." Eleanor gasped, tears streaming down her face. She felt as though the ground beneath her had vanished, leaving her weightless and adrift. Elliot wasn't just gone from her life. He was gone forever. "I didn't even get to say goodbye," she whispered, her voice breaking. Henry reached across the table, his gnarled hand covering hers. "Neither did I," he said, his voice thick with grief. "And I've carried that regret every day since." For a long moment they sat in silence, their shared loss binding them together. The weight of their pain was heavy, but in that moment neither of them felt alone. "Mr. Henry," Eleanor said finally, her voice resolute, "you've been through so much. But I want you to know you're not alone anymore. We're connected through Elliot, and I want to help you however I can." Henry looked at her, his eyes filling with gratitude. "You've already done more for me today than I could have ever hoped for." But Eleanor wasn't done. Her thoughts turned to another figure, the woman who had driven Elliot away. "Henry," she said carefully, "what about Margaret? Where is she now?" Henry's expression darkened. He looked away, his shoulders slumping under an invisible weight. "She's still with me. In a way. After we lost everything, we ended up on the streets. She's not the woman she used to be, Eleanor. The years and the guilt have broken her." Eleanor's heart ached at the thought. Part of her wanted to blame Margaret, to hold her accountable for what had happened to Elliot. But another part of her, a softer, more compassionate part, felt only sadness. "I need to meet her," Eleanor said firmly. "Not to confront her, but to understand. If we're going to find peace, I need to see her." Henry hesitated, then nodded slowly. "She's in the park, just a few blocks from here. It's where we go when we have nowhere else." Eleanor stood, her resolve hardening. "Then let's go." But before they left, Eleanor turned to the viewers she felt certain were still captivated by this journey. "What would you do in my shoes?" she asked. "Could you forgive the person who tore your life apart? Let me know in the comments. And stay with me, because the next chapter of this story might surprise you." The park was quiet, the winter chill wrapping itself around the bare branches of the trees. A few pigeons pecked at crumbs scattered across the frozen ground, and the occasional passerby hurried through, their collars turned up against the cold. Henry and Eleanor walked side by side, his step slow and unsteady, hers purposeful yet apprehensive. "There she is," Henry said softly, nodding toward a bench beneath an old oak tree. Eleanor followed his gaze. Sitting there, wrapped in a threadbare coat and clutching a small bag, was Margaret. Her once proud posture was gone, replaced by a frail, hunched figure. Her hair, now grey and dishevelled, framed a face etched with lines of pain and regret. She stared ahead blankly, as if the world around her no longer mattered. Eleanor hesitated. This was the woman who had caused so much pain, who had driven Elliot away and ultimately contributed to his downfall. A part of her wanted to turn back, to leave Margaret to the solitude she had chosen. But another part of her, the part that Elliot had once loved, knew she had to face this moment. "Margaret!" Henry called gently as they approached. Margaret turned her head slowly, her eyes narrowing when she saw Eleanor. Recognition dawned, and with it a flicker of defiance. "What's she doing here?" Margaret asked, her voice hoarse but still sharp. Henry hesitated, glancing at Eleanor for support. She stepped forward, her voice steady but kind. "I came to talk," Eleanor said, "about Elliot." At the mention of his name, Margaret's expression shifted. The defiance melted away, replaced by something raw and unguarded. "Elliot," she whispered, her hands trembling as she clutched the bag tighter. "Why now? Why, after all these years?" "Because it's time," Eleanor said firmly. "Time to face what happened. Time to heal." Margaret shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. "There's no healing for what I've done. I ruined my son's life. I destroyed everything."
"You didn't destroy everything," Eleanor said, her voice softening.
"Henry is still here, and so am I. We're all connected through Elliot, and we all carry the pain of losing him, but we can't keep living in that pain." Margaret's lips quivered. "You think I don't know that? Every night I hear his voice. I see his face, and every time I remember how I pushed him away, how I made him choose between us. And then he was gone." She broke down, her frail body shaking as sobs racked her chest. Henry sat beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Margaret," he said softly, "we've both made mistakes. We've both carried this burden. But maybe it's time we let it go. For Elliot." Eleanor knelt before her, meeting Margaret's tear-filled gaze. "I'm not here to blame you," she said. "I'm here because I believe Elliot would want us to find peace. He loved us both, and I think he'd want us to honour his memory by forgiving ourselves and each other." Margaret looked at Eleanor, her eyes searching for something, perhaps a sign of sincerity, or perhaps the forgiveness she had been too afraid to ask for. Slowly she nodded, her tears falling freely. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "For everything." Eleanor placed her hand over Margaret's. "I forgive you," she said, her own tears spilling over, "and I hope you can forgive yourself." The three of them sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of years of pain and regret lifting ever so slightly. The cold air seemed less biting, the park less barren. Together they had taken the first step toward healing. Before we continue, here's something to think about. Have you ever had to forgive someone who hurt you deeply? Was it easy, or was it the hardest thing you've ever done? Share your story in the comments below, and stay tuned because this story isn't over yet. The next chapter will reveal a surprising twist that changes everything. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the park as Eleanor, Henry, and Margaret sat in the stillness of their shared understanding. The air felt lighter now, the weight of the past beginning to ease. Eleanor stood helping Henry to his feet, while Margaret slowly rose, her frailty more evident than ever. "I don't know how I can ever repay your kindness," Margaret said softly, her voice cracking as she spoke. "But I feel lighter, like maybe there's a way forward after all." Eleanor smiled gently. "We're not done yet. Let's go somewhere warm and talk more." As they walked together, Eleanor couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Something about the way Henry had spoken about Elliot earlier, about the watch, about his final days, didn't quite add up. She knew there was more to the story. She just wasn't sure if she was ready to hear it. Back at Eleanor's home, the warmth of the fireplace filled the room as Henry and Margaret sat on the plush sofa sipping hot tea. Eleanor excused herself briefly to retrieve something from her bedroom, a small wooden box, weathered but carefully preserved. She carried it back to the living room, her hands trembling slightly. "This box," Eleanor began, placing it gently on the coffee table, "holds everything I kept of Elliot. Letters, photos, memories I couldn't let go of even when I tried." Henry and Margaret leaned forward, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Eleanor opened the box, revealing a stack of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. She handed the bundle to Henry, who took it with reverence. "These are from Elliot?" Henry asked, his voice thick with emotion. Eleanor nodded. "He sent them to me when we were apart. I never showed them to anyone before now." Margaret's hand hovered over the letters, hesitant to touch them. "May I?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Eleanor nodded, her heart pounding as Margaret carefully untied the ribbon. She pulled out the first letter, her trembling hands unfolding the paper. As she read, tears began to stream down her face. "Dearest Eleanor," Margaret read aloud, her voice quivering. "Not a day goes by that I don't think of you. I want to tell you everything, but I can't. I don't know how to fix this mess I've made. All I know is that I love you and I'm sorry." Margaret's voice broke, and she handed the letter to Henry, unable to continue. He took it, his eyes scanning the words as tears blurred his vision. But it was the final letter in the stack that changed everything. Henry unfolded the last piece of paper, his hands shaking. As he read, his face paled. This
isn't just to Eleanor," he said, his voice trembling.
"It's to us, me and Margaret." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked, leaning closer. Henry read aloud. "To my parents, I wish I could have told you this in person. I tried so hard to make you both happy, but I realized too late that I can't live up to the person you wanted me to be. I hope one day you can forgive me for the choices I made and for leaving. I love you both, and I always will." The room fell into stunned silence. Eleanor sat frozen, her mind racing. The letter wasn't just a farewell, it was a confession. Elliot hadn't just left, he had been carrying the weight of everyone's expectations, and it had consumed him. Margaret's hands flew to her face as sobs racked her body. "We pushed him too hard," she cried. "We broke him." Henry reached for her, his own tears streaming down his face. "We didn't know, Margaret. We thought we were doing what was best." Eleanor felt her own tears falling, but amidst the grief a sense of clarity emerged. "He loved all of us," she said softly. "Even in his pain he was thinking of us. We can't change what happened, but we can honour him by letting go of the guilt and finding peace." Margaret nodded, her sobs subsiding as she clutched Henry's hand. "For Elliot," she whispered. "We'll try." As the three of them sat together, the fire crackling softly in the background, Eleanor felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't the ending she had envisioned, but it was a chance to heal and to keep Elliot's memory alive in the love they shared. "Now, Let me ask you, what would you have done if you were in their shoes? Could you find it in your heart to forgive, even after all the pain? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. If this story has touched you, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Elderly Wisdom for more unforgettable stories like this one. Your support helps us keep sharing these powerful tales of love, loss, and redemption. Let's continue spreading wisdom one story at a time. Stay tuned for the final chapter. It's a conclusion you won't want to miss.